All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:02, and we're gonna do SEVA VentRounds. Today is March 23rd, 2021, and I welcome everybody. Some disclosures we have to do today. The first one is we will discuss particulars of ventilator modes. There's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinics at all. You'll hear me, I'm Eduardo Mireles. I have received fees for books, chapters, and lectures, and I co-own with Rob and the clinic a patent on mid-frequency ventilation, which has not generated anything, just exists. And then Rob is consultant for these companies and also receives fees and royalties. So those are our disclosures. In terms of ground rules, this is a recorded session, so just keep your microphone muted. The moderator, that is me, may call upon members of the audience to comment. We want to have a very interactive session. We welcome that. If you want to comment or send us any particular statement, just send it via the chat function. I'm monitoring it constantly. And we're going to use today, different to other sessions, WebEx poll. So in the past, we were using the poll anywhere, but obviously that meant you guys had to use two different systems. So now we'll use a single system for this, which is the WebEx poll. We'll see how it works. If it doesn't work, so be it. I do know that fellows are on the line, and we really welcome them. This is a safe space, as I always say, for anybody to reach out. If you're interested in participating or jumping into any of these cases, what I would ask is that you send me a chat message here and say, Eduardo, I'm in, hit me. Many of you have already seen, and I'm actually very proud of the pre-teaser, that the answers that you all got. Very impressive knowledge on ventilator reading. So very welcome. So to start, the first question that I would ask everybody is, where are you joining us from? So type it in the chat. This is actually cool for all of us to see where we're coming from and where we're connecting from. Right, from Georgia, Lexington, Kentucky. Children's Hospital at Samur, hey, Connecticut, Peoria, Illinois. I know that you asked me to annotate on the screen. I will not give you access, because if not, you can. It just creates some challenges on our screen. From Johnstown, Saudi Arabia. Fabulous, Ohio. All right, so we have a pretty broad group. Samid from Cleveland. Excellent. Well, welcome all. Here we go. So we're going to start with the first waveform. This one actually came this way from all the way from here. This is ours. And I'll start with a very relatively simple waveform on this patient, but it has a lot of information. So I want to give it a try. Is anybody interested on jumping on this one and going through our method of reading it? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out the poll. Here comes the poll for all of you. It's asking me, Cisco, your share video. All right. So you're getting the poll right now.
Dr. Mireles, I'm happy to jump in after the poll as well if you'd like me to. This is Ali.
Thank you, Ali. I appreciate it. So all of you are answering. I'll share the answers in a second. Just keep answering what you see on this waveform. And I know that for many, this is new and saying what is the tag and what is the load. And we'll go on to this, and it will help us arrive. Okay, I'm gonna close the poll. And I'll leave you. I see that you have not finished. Actually, these things tells you who has finished and not. I'll give you a couple of more minutes. Take a look at it. Put a lot of information there. Alrighty, so I'm gonna share the results. And I'll share the responses with everybody. This is good. This method is so everybody goes in order with it. Here goes the results. So you should be able to see them now. Majority of the group read this as volume control, CMBS. What is the load? The majority thought that it was resistive. Some of the group thought that it was elastic. The trigger was normal. The inspiration was normal. The cycle was normal and there was no expiration on this. So very good. Ali, do you want to jump on it and guide us through how you read this? What were you thinking, my friend?
Sure. So to kind of look at the tag and to see what the control variable is, I like to look at the flow waveform. The flow waveform looks pretty consistent. So I would think this is going to be volume control. It looks to be that it's this machine triggered and machine cycled. So I would call this CMV. I'm not seeing any patient interaction over here, and we are setting all the parameters. So I would call this a set point. So for me, this would be volume control CMVS.
Very good.
In terms of the load, I like to look at the expiratory part of the flow waveform, which tells us what the time constant is, which is the product of compliance times resistance. This looks like in this situation, it's about 1.5 seconds, which looks pretty normal. Since there is no patient interaction or PPMUS, I think this is, I would call that the load would be elastic in this situation, both in inspiration and expiration. The expiratory curve looks like it's reaching the baseline and it's not prolonged. So I don't think there's any resistive load in my opinion, but we can discuss more. There's no patient interactions. I would say there's no PV discordance, and it would be normal trigger, normal inspiration, normal cycle, and normal expiration.
Very good. So let's talk. So no patient. So let's go in order. I know that for many this is a new item. So and I put this was intentionally here, Ali, because it has a lot of information about the physiology of the patient. So let's start by the first item, and it's the tag. And you recognize, I mean, I put it here, that this is exactly what we're controlling is flow. So you see the flow is a square. It's being controlled by the ventilator. So that's why it's volume controlled. You very well recognize the breath sequence, in which in this case it's CMB, or controlled or continuous mandatory ventilation. And that means that the breaths are either triggered or cycled by the ventilator. In this case, Both of them are machine triggered and cycled. So this definitely is a mandatory breath, and every single one of them is appropriately a mandatory breath. And finally, set point. Set point is the targeting scheme, and there's 7 targeting schemes, and it's essentially how the computer controls the valves and the flow and the ventilator itself. And this is the most simple one, in which you just set the flow and the I time, and it gives you this. So set point in volume control. So excellent job there, Ali. The next item is the load. And I wanted to put this one in with all intention to try to look dissect it and put some thoughts that I think that would be useful for all the fellows out there, and actually in general. Ali, do you remember the equation of motion?
Yep. So it should be P mass plus P vent is equal to flow times volume plus resistance times compliance. Am I getting it right?
Almost.
Flow times resistance plus volume times compliance, or elastic. Elastic, yeah.
Great job. So I'm gonna show you a thing that is gonna. I mean, it blows my mind every time I think about it, because when I first heard about the equation of motion, I would say that I didn't come to the light until later. So what this means is essentially these are the loads, right? The resistive load and the elastic load. And so either the ventilator or the patient and the ventilator have to overcome these loads, the flow times resistance or the volume times elastance. These two are actually, if you do the multiplication here, it ends up being in centimeters of water. So it's pressure units. So this is that's why this is a pressure, it equals a pressure. These two plus these two equals a pressure. So the thing that opened my eyes, and that's why we have to do these loads, is if you think about this, about the ventilator screen. So up here you have the P vent, yes? Then over here you have the flow, right? And over here you have the volume. So you know that the flow times the resistance gives you the resistive load, and the volume times the elastance gives you the elastic load. So this one plus this one equals what you see up here. So the equation of motion has always been in front of your face whenever you're looking at the ventilator screen. And the cool part of this is because you know that this, if you multiply the flow times the resistance, it gives you a pressure. Essentially, this shape is over here. Sorry. This shape is right here. So this would be the resistive load or resistive pressure. And then you can see, because the flow is constant, that there's a triangle here, and that's that triangle up here. So it gives you the shapes, and now you know how to read the elastic and resistive loads when you're looking at this. So the first step up that you see on this equals to the resistive load, and then the slope represents the elastic load. So now that I have told you that, does this, now imagine, Ali, that I give, or everybody, that I increase the resistance on this patient. I give higher resistance on the patient. This is not going to change because the machine is delivering the flow, it's controlling it. But what will happen is that, because it's a multiplication, this is a scaling factor, now this will look much higher. I'm trying to make the exact same shape, sorry. And so you can, if there's changes in resistance, this initial step up will go much higher. Does that make sense? So that's how you read the load. So now that I have told you that, you can see this waveform, and you can see how this, so the elastic load, if you are, the elastance is worse for each change in volume, the pressure is going to rise even higher. So you can imagine here that if I am doing that, the slope, if the elastance goes up or the compliance goes down, the slope is going to be much higher. So that's what you see. So in this patient, the change in flow, the change in pressure per unit of volume is not that steep. But actually what you see is a very high step up at the beginning of the breath. And actually, if you imagine if we did an expiratory pause on this patient, the pressure would go down all the way to this level and go down. If I do that there, would that change your thought process, Ali? On the load from elastic to resistive?
So you're saying that if you're going to do an expiratory hold, then if the pressure is above the PEEP, is that what you're saying? Sorry.
No, what I'm saying is when you do an inspiratory hold, right? What you eliminate is flow, right?
Right.
So the pressure would come from up here all the way down to this level, which is this line over here.
Yep.
And so now you see this step up from down up here all the way down here. So the patient is requiring all of this amount of pressure, which is resistive pressure. So it's the same amount of scale up that over here. So this starts making me more suspicious that this is actually a resistive load.
Okay.
And so then you go and look out, as you said, to the expiratory, and you were perfect there. You talked about the other way to read this is when there's what you're controlling is the pressure, is the time constant. So you can see that this goes and it doesn't reach zero. So it may be that the resistance is high, but if the resistive load is high, or that the breaths are too close together because the rate is going too fast. But this has to be ruled out because you have some hints for increased resistance and some hints here for increased resistance. So in this case, what you would start thinking is, ooh, could this patient have a high resistance or at least auto PEEP, which could sabotage our existence? I'm going to check the chat to see if there's any questions out there. If the BC up top wasn't visible, it would be hard to distinguish IMB from CMB here since the patient is not triggering. True statement, Samur. It would have to be a very fast IMB on this patient, so meaning that they set up the basal rate. So sometimes it's very hard to see it through just the waveforms.
Eduardo?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Adi. I have a question.
Yes, Adi, go ahead.
You talked about the equation of motion, which is essentially a balance of pressures from the innate properties of the lung and the ventilatory system. Why aren't you adding PEEP into the equation?
Yes, and you can absolutely add the PEEP. So the PEEP goes on this side of the equation. So you add the PEEP on that side. I don't add it consistently because that's the baseline, and it usually just generates confusion in the rest of the world. But you're right. The PEEP is part of the equation.
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
I do it the same way you do, because if you define pressure on the left-hand side as relative to baseline, then that works. If you want to add more information, then you have to add auto PEEP on the right. And if you want to calculate power, it actually turns out to be better to just put gauge pressure or pressure above atmosphere on the left and then total PEEP on the right. So there's many different forms of the equation of motion, and they're used for different things. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, this is the simplest form.
Perfect. So the next question I had is Mariam asked me, basically you look at the flow waveform first. Yes, absolutely. If it's a nice figure, Mariam, it is definitely a a volume control. Remember, ventilators are very good at controlling flow. They are mediocre at best at controlling pressure. I don't know if that makes sense. So we'll see some examples immediately after this. Any other questions about this waveform?
Yeah, did you want to talk about stress index, or is that too much now?
Yes, definitely. So actually, that's a good point. You all have heard about stress index as one of the markers that you look in this portion of the breath. So from here to here, you look at the slope, and essentially, as we have described, is given by this relationship between volume and elastance. So bright investigators essentially said, if it's a straight line, the compliance is linear and it's not changing throughout the breath. However, if the compliance is going like this, right, with this new figure, let me change color so that it's more colorful. So if it goes up like that, that means that the compliance at the beginning was worse, was lower, and as the breath is being delivered, the compliance starts improving and then it flattens, and which means that the patient is recruiting long as you're giving the breath. The other deviation that you can have, and this is obviously on patients that are passive, that are not moving at all, is that it looks like that it has this scooping. And under those circumstances, at the beginning of the breath, the pressure is not changing much, and then or it's kind of flat, and then at the end of the breath, for every little volume that you deliver, it goes up higher pressure. And so under those circumstances, this would be a patient that is over distending during the breath. So what they did is they created an equation, and where you want that equation to be equal to 1. And if it's above that or below that, it talks about recruiting or over distension. You can see that there's the poor man method that I have seen, that people pull out a credit card and put it on top, or a piece of paper. I would say that that's most likely not the best way to do it. Besides that, it can change from breath to breath if there's PMOS or there's other aberrancies. So probably using the software is the best way to do that. Go ahead, Rob. You want to add to that?
Just one little thing. Everything you said was really good. What we're looking at is the slope of the pressure time curve, and we're inferring elastance or compliance from it. And the reason why we can do that is because you have a constant flow. So that means the horizontal axis could be scaled to mean volume. So since flow is constant and multiply by the time, and you get volume, so it's actually the same shape as the pressure volume curve. What that means is that at any point on that curve, the slope is elastance. So if the slope is a high number, it's a high elastance or low compliance, and vice versa. So that's just another way of explaining what you just showed graphically with your red, yellow, and blue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Roberto. And Samur asks if this would be, if the airway has a collapsing portion that it's opening up. Yeah, I mean, you can have areas that open up at some point, and then you essentially recruit. It looks like recruitment. It's simply that you opened up an airway that could be collapsible for X or Y reason. So great discussion. All righty.
One question. So when we look at the time constant method to determine the load, so this situation, technically the time constant is within the normal 1.4, 1.5 second parameter. But I guess, I mean, I should have looked more closely. It looks like, yeah, it's very like, to my eye, when I was looking at it, I thought it was going back to baseline. But when I look at it closely, yeah, it's probably just below the baseline. So do you think the time constant is artificially normal just because the rate is too high? Is that what's happening here?
That's a great question. I actually have been thinking a lot about, and Lee, you're bringing out a point, which is what number is normal for time constant. We've had a really good a manuscript that actually Rob and Jean-Michel Arnal and Ariel Garnero published on values for actually simulation, to using simulation for mechanical ventilation. And what they did is they pulled out data out of dozens of variables that were measured in patients using a specific ventilator. And from that, we know that there are certain values or standard values that would be for a normal patient that is paralyzed on the ventilator, patient with obstructive disease and with ARDS of different degrees. So when you think about that, when I see this, I try to, obviously just from looking at the waveform, you have to try to figure out what is normal and what is abnormal and where the problem is. And so if this was a normal patient, the time constant in these circumstances may be completely normal, because the time constant on these patients, the usual resistance on a patient that is intubated is around 10, and the compliance around 50, which puts you at the time constant of 0.5, which would give you around 2.5 seconds to fully exhale your lungs. And so under those circumstances, you would say, no, this is normal for this patient because he's breathing at a fast respiratory rate. On the other side, if I told you this was a patient with ARDS, and as you can see with a high PEEP, high FiO2, and you see this, you would expect this patient actually to have a shorter time constant. So this is the opposite of what you were expecting. So what I'm doing here is giving you a little bit of background that will help you understand where you are, depending on the patient. So that those values that you're quoting may be completely normal for a patient with ARDS, and what you're looking is where you are with it. On these circumstances, just by looking at the waveform, I would be concerned on this patient with high resistance because of these two values, but it could be completely normal.
Got it. Thanks very much.
No, thank you, Ali. Great statements. Yeah, so Huzaifa asks us, how do we confirm the actual stress index if there is variation from breath to breath, as you mentioned? That's great. So if there's PMOS, it's very hard to read the stress index. So if there's PMOS, meaning effort from the patient, so you have to have a breath that there is no PMOS. In some of them, and what this index does is it keeps giving you the values through time. So you have to see where you are and what's the value that you do. Obviously, if you're doing the stress index to adjust PEEP or to adjust your ventilator settings, the presence of PMOS will sabotage that. And so some people may choose to temporarily either sedate or paralyze the patient.
Yeah, and the servos will display stress index, but none of the other ventilators will.
That's right. Wow. I mean, who would think that a volume control CMBS would give us so much to talk about, huh? That was pretty cool. All righty. The next one comes all the way from Beirut. And this was sent to me for us to discuss here. And I thought that this was a really cool example of painful interaction. So I'm going to open the poll for all of you to jump in and feel it now that you know a little bit more of how to feel this mode. So we start with the tag. So are we controlling pressure or volume? Then what's the breath sequence, CMB, CSB, or IMB? And then the targeting scheme, which I know that for many, this is a new language, but it helps us understand what the ventilator does here. So there's set point, dual, adaptive, servo, which is an R, optimal, intelligent, and biovariable. Then after that, we talk about the load, which we just spent a fair amount of time talking about. It could be resistive or elastic. And then finally, we talk about the interaction with the trigger, if it's normal, if it happened early or late in reference to the patient, if it was false or failed, if in the expiration is work shifting, we'll talk about that more, and then cycle, and then expiration, which is missing on the poll, but we'll give it a pass for today. So I see 23 of you are answering. A couple have finished. I'll give you a couple of minutes more. In the meantime, if any of the fellows or respiratory therapist for all it matters wants to give it a shot, just let me know either in the chat or speak up. I'm happy either way. Otherwise, I'll do it. All right, Samir, thank you for jumping in. Not yet. Just give me a second. People are moving through it. I know that it's a little bit challenging. This is not an easy waveform, so I love that they sent it to us from Beirut. I send a shout out to Luisito Shimose. I see him on the list of attendants, ex-fellow from the critical care program here. And Rishik. Alrighty. I'm gonna close the poll. It's gonna start closing in a little bit, okay? 20 seconds to finish. All right, Samir, are you ready to roll?
About that, but I can give it a try.
I know you can. What color do you want? Choose a color.
How about we go with yellow this time?
Yellow it is. Okay. Here comes the poll, and I'll share the results with everybody so that they can see how we answered. And essentially, the majority of the population there were between PCCMBS or PCCMBA, which is adaptive. So pressure control, continuous mandatory ventilation, adaptive. A couple of people thought this was IMB. The load, the majority thought this was PMOS, and the second group thought this was elastic. A couple of people thought this was resistive. In the trigger, the majority of people felt this was a failed trigger. And the majority thought that there was work shifting, which was mild. And some people thought that there was either normal, early, or late. So pretty balanced. All righty. Oh, go for it. Samit, guide us.
So I see that the control variable seems to be pressure as I look at the flow waveform, and it's not nowhere close to perfect. So I would say pressure control. There's a combination of at least a breath trigger. There are breath triggers that are by the machine, and they're cycling. The breath is being cycled by the machine, and then there's some triggers that are being initiated by the patient. So I also get CMV. Now what kind of scheme? I think it appears, and I can be absolutely wrong here, adaptive. But I can be absolutely wrong here. I think it's responding to patient effort, and it's just proportionally changing. But I have no clue to what it is. Now, coming to the load, I can say it's pretty much PMUS, especially both in the inspiration and expiration. I think it's mainly PMUS, though the time constant seems very shorter in the inspiration compared to the expiration, but it's very hard to say with that kind of patient ventilator interaction available in the breath sequence. Trigger I felt was normal. I didn't feel that there was any late or missed or delayed triggers. Inspiration, there appears to be some work shifting in the inspiration that I would go that way, and cycling I think is normal. I don't see any early cycling or whatnot. And then coming to expiration, I think there is this negative flow. So I think the patient is trying to work during expiration. So I would say there is some expiratory work shifting. At least that's my take on it.
Very good. Thank you, Samit, for jumping in. Lots of thoughts here. When you see this, I agree completely with you. You don't see pressure. The pressure is being controlled here. It's flat throughout the breath. And this doesn't look at all like any geometric figure that you draw during kindergarten. So this is definitely a pressure control. The second one is CMB. So you're looking for what triggers and what cycles the breath, right? So you recognize that some breaths are triggered by the patient and some breaths are triggered by the machine. This is a patient, a breath triggered by the patient, and actually it's cycled. You can see the pressure continues. And even though the patient exhaled over here, the machine said, you're going to continue to have the pressure there until the end, and then boom, you're able to exhale. So this is machine cycled, which immediately makes this every single one of these breaths a continuous mandatory breath. And finally, there's the adaptive target, which on this look, it's very hard for me to see if the pressure is being adapted, going up or down, and it would be easy for me to say that it's S. However, I left this up here as a clue for the group, and many people, I mean, we don't use this ventilator at this, we have some here, but we are not using it in constant practice, so I understand, Samit, why this would not look to you, but I put here what we call the Rosetta card, and I put which has all the modes classified, and this is the live work of Rob, and you can see here the Hamilton G5, which is the one that we're showing, and then APV stands for adaptive pressure ventilation. CMB is, as you stated, PCCMBA. So in the Hamilton, adaptive pressure ventilation is the name for what you now know as PRVC, or as autoflow, or as BC plus. It has many names in the literature. Does that help you? Yes. So that's the targeting scheme. And what that would mean is that if the patient was not getting his tidal volume, which you can see that he's set at 640 of tidal volume, if he doesn't get that tidal volume, which you see he's getting, then the machine would be increasing the pressure. And if the patient is getting less than that, it would start going up on the pressure. If he's getting less, then he would go up. So the opposite, the pressure of the ventilator adjusts the pressures to deliver the target tidal volume. So
there's another clue here. Even if you didn't have the Rosetta card, you could clearly see that this is a form of pressure control ventilation. And if you look at the operator set controls on the right, it says volume target. So this is volume targeted pressure control, which is just a generic word for, or a specific word for adaptive targeting.
Exactly. Thank you, Roberto. Yes, you can see it here, B target. All righty. The second thing that you talked about was what is the load, and this one is a tricky one because obviously there's the patient triggers, and during inspiration you can see this deformation of the pressure during the breath when the patient is doing effort. So normally this waveform should look like a nice, beautiful square like that. That's how it should look. And as I told you, ventilators are mediocre at controlling pressure. And so what you see here is that area that represents the PMOS that you can see the patient doing effort down here. So without a doubt, there's evidence of PMOS, but once that the PMOS is over, you can see the patient finish his breath. It goes not rapidly, super fast back to baseline. And actually the patient tries to exhale. All of these are exhalations. Anything below the baseline is that the patient is actually exhaling during inspiration because the breath is so long that the patient is exhaling here. So when I see this, and you can see the time to return to baseline, this is 1 second. It takes it less than a second. So this gives you indication that there's PMOS without a doubt, as you pointed out, but and you mentioned this, that there was evidence of an increased elastic component, but that means the time constant is very short. Boom, it contracts very, very rapidly. And Rishik, sorry, Rishik, I'll go back just to the tag, the PCCMBA. Rishik comments on this breath over here, which is, if you can see here, that this is from the prior, it's just starting the breath. So from this breath, it goes here and it continues over here. That the pressure is below than the other one, and that would be a hint that this is a PRVC breath. So good point and catch up, Rishik. So this is a patient that has very high elastic load that exhales relatively fast and returns to baseline in a rapid return. So that would make me suspicious for that on this patient. Somebody mentioned that this looked like APRV, and yes, Mariam, when I saw this the first time, I said, is this APRV? And it's because you were looking at the very long inspiratory time and with some evidence of inspiratory effort on top, which the patient is doing without a doubt. But what happened here is actually that the cycle time, the inspiratory time was left too long. So the time from here to here, the inspiratory time, actually, if you notice here, these are seconds, actually 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. The inspiratory time is going from around 11 and a half all the way to here. So it's almost 2 seconds of inspiratory time.
Yeah. Also, the first breath I thought looked like a spontaneous breath. That's why I thought it was APRV.
Absolutely. So the patient did an effort here, but he cannot trigger because he's on top of the breath. So that's you're absolutely right, because you're controlling pressure. The patient can do whatever he wants on top of that breath. The ventilator will not stop him.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. The excellent question from Ahmed also. He asked me, how is the patient able to exhale during the inspiration and yet it's CMB? Yeah. Well, remember that this is that the patient can blow out during inspiration, and the valve, it's called the active exhalation valve, will be open out. Not every ventilator does that. Some ventilators, even in pressure control, say you try to exhale and they will close the valve. And I'll show you an example a little bit later. So the patient will not be able to exhale, and you'll see essentially the flow shuts down here. In some ventilators, that's a fake statement, but in general, it does. It will allow you with that active exhalation valve. Rob?
Yeah, that brings up a very interesting question. And that's the very reason why we have defined IMV the way we have. If anybody can recall the exact definition of IMV, it means that a spontaneous breath can occur between 2 mandatory breaths. This is happening within a mandatory breath, so it does not make it IMV. And that's the exact reason why we did it that way. And also for APRV, it happens in APRV as well.
And I don't think IntelliVent is activated on this mode.
Yeah, probably not, because it's dimmed, right?
Yep.
I had a question.
Yep, go ahead.
So in terms of from the engineering standpoint, how does this mode differ from APRV? If you have an active exhalation valve, you can breathe during the I time. So you can do the same during APRV. It's just that the T low is very low. Now the same ventilator offers an APRV mode, but from an engineering standpoint, like I don't see any difference between this and APRV if you can breathe during the I time. But
because APRV is IMV. Because in APRV you can breathe spontaneously between mandatory breaths. If the patient tried to make an inspiratory effort between 2 mandatory breaths in this mode, he'd get another mandatory breath. So the fact that you can breathe in and out during a mandatory inspiratory time has nothing to do with whether it's CMV or IMV.
Got it.
Right. Good question. That points out why it's very important to have a specific definition for IMV versus CMV.
Excellent. All right, so this is bringing just a lot of thought about why knowing what the tag is, it's important here, and trying to understand what happens. during inspiration. And the key message that I'm listening right now is just remember that in pressure control, you're able to breathe on top of that if you want. And actually, just think about this in what we call early trigger or reverse trigger. Those patients take a breath during pressure control or during whichever mode you want during the breath. And that doesn't make it IMB suddenly because the patient took the breath and didn't trigger the breath.
Another interesting thing about this waveform, Eduardo, is you notice that the peak inspiratory flow is much higher than the peak expiratory flow.
Yes.
And that combined with the deformation of the pressure waveform during the trigger phase or shortly after that, indicates that this patient is making very short, high inspiratory efforts and then relaxing very quickly. So that's why you get that little expiratory blip during the T time, inspiratory time. And then you get a bigger exhalation during the expiratory time. And if you add those two areas below zero flow, you'll get the area above zero flow. So the expiratory volume has to be equal to the inspiratory volume, but the inspiratory inspiratory volume is all happening in the first few milliseconds.
Very good. So now let's go to PV discordance. This is a beauty. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I'm almost sure that that's the case here. When there's the marker for patient trigger on the Hamilton is this little arrow over here, right?
Yes,
yeah.
That's correct.
So now that I have pointed that out, let's go in order of breaths. I'm going to skip this one for a second. We'll come back to that one. But if you see this one, who triggered the breath, the patient or the machine? Do you see the little arrow? And there's no deflection here. So this means that the machine triggered the breath. But you see evidence of PMOS afterwards. So there's a patient breath after that. What's the name of that? That would be if the ventilator triggers earlier than the patient. That's called early trigger. So this breath over here has early trigger. Okay. The next one has a nice, the patient activates, he gets pressurized, that's good. This one again. In this one, it's the exact same thing. Actually, you see there's mandatory. Well, actually, yeah, there's no trigger. And then there's this activity on top, another early trigger breath for them. So exactly. Early trigger is machine. Thank you very much, Michael Fisher. So this is early and normal. And you can see this is a classic thing. When you're looking at the screen, there is going to be breaths that may have nothing abnormal with them, and that may be the preponderance of them. And then one that it's all messed up. And that doesn't mean that you have to change everything on this patient just because that one is messed up, but it may. It depends what you're seeing. So I think that you have normal breaths, as you pointed out, and a couple of early trigger breaths. You recognize very well work shifting, a couple of work shifting. It's moderate to mild because the pressure never goes below baseline. So that's our marker for severe work shifting, meaning that the patient is doing more work than the ventilator does, or not more work, but the work that the patient is doing is shifting the work that the ventilator is doing. And finally, cycle. With all that we have talked, now you know this is the trigger of the breath, right? This one is the trigger. And the patient is exhaling here, but the ventilator finishes the exhalation all the way over here. So this is where the patient wants to finish the breath. This is where the machine said to finish. So this is the machine ended later than the patient wanted. So this is a classic example of late cycle. And so you have early and normal trigger, and you have work shifting, and you have late trigger. And you mentioned a little bit of work, expiratory work. I am not entirely sure that there's expiratory work. Maybe over here, actually, I would say that is actually evidence of expiratory work, but the majority of them are normal. So this was a really a waveform that had a lot of information. Now, I will ask the audience, but now that you have read this waveform, what would be the action that you would do to modify and to help this patient? And if you want to type it, that's fair, into the chat message. So the options are, I'm not gonna do anything, Eduardo, stop bothering. The second option, go ahead.
Dr. Mireles, I think the problem is the inspiratory time, and the cycling is too long. I mean, it's an early trigger. We might have to start by either changing the trigger sensitivity or changing it from a pressure to a flow trigger, and then the eye time being too long maybe is complicating the problem, and maybe reducing the eye time and
Yeah, I think that the sensitivity, I don't think is an issue. You can see that he's triggering very nicely without dropping the pressure majorly. So, but I do think that decreasing the eye time would be the first item that you may want to do over here, because he evidently has efforts that are short. So now, sometimes this is done to maintain the mean airway pressure, but there's other ways to maintain the mean airway pressure than long eye time. And so, and Russell, to that point, is you could let him breathe and have CPAP if he's able to generate enough effort on his own with pressure support and CPAP. That's one of the options. So giving him more control of the breath. The other one is if he cannot maintain the minute ventilation, is to just simply decrease the eye time on this patient. So really good points. Yeah, so that's right, Rishik. Changing the sensitivity might cause patients discomfort. I mean, sometimes and I've seen this, and I frankly think that this would be probably the last option in the universe, is locking the patient out. So trying to sabotage the existence of the patient by making the ventilator really hard for him to trigger, so that the trigger desynchrony goes away. You're going to create more trigger delay. Morgan, that's a great point. I mean, how tall is this human being, right? He's getting 640 mLs of tidal volume with a restrictive, with an elastic predominant issue. So it makes you think, I mean, unless he's a COPD or a very tall individual, how do we go at it? With changing from pressure to flow trigger, change trigger sensitivity. It does. Flow trigger usually is more sensitive than pressure, Mariam. Sorry, Samir. It's so flow is more sensitive, but this is not an issue of usually when you change your trigger is because you have a late trigger, so the patient is doing effort and the machine is taking a while to trigger the breath, which is not the case right now. What would happen if you sedate this patient? Yeah, good question. Is you probably, well, based on what I'm seeing here, he would end up with a minute ventilation of 6.4 liters, because he has a breath rate of 10 and a tidal volume of 640. So sometimes that's what you need to do, is sedate them and let them recover from what it's going on. Very good. I'm gonna end here. These are outstanding questions and discussion. I want to show just there were a lot of curves, but this is becoming more like the VentRounds that we used to have at the bedside. So this is the CME credit for whichever staff is on. I will share now. Actually, we have created a landing page, and in the next days, we're gonna start posting the videos there for all of you to be able to see that. Here's the link. Just copy it. It takes you to a page where actually the WebEx link is. If you click that, you will come into the meeting immediately, and we're gonna be posting there some articles, some of the material that we have produced, some links on how to get more into the courses that we're talking about. And finally, you're going to have access to all the videos that are being recorded throughout. So with that, I'm thankful, Rob, of all your input, and I know that Rob and I are very thankful of our fellows and team for being part and helping us learn together. So thank you very much, everybody.